From these various considerations we come to a major one, therefore, namely that for some reason nearly every work of man must be subjected to powerful revitalization periodically. Today we will say, in all probability, that necessity produced the sage. That in some way it was the emergency in man's own nature that called upon his own brother man to rise and meet that need. I doubt if the ancients would have argued with this point of view, but they would also have pointed out that history, being the sequential unfolding record of events, that history in some mysterious way frames this pattern of needs, distinguishes this pattern as though rungs upon a ladder, and that history therefore is an integrated organism, that history is not a record of incidents or accidents, but a continuous report of the unfolding of basic and immutable laws, that these laws are under the control of cyclic energy. And we can gain certain sympathy in this thinking from Spengler's work on the decline of the West. In this work, Oswald Spengler points out that all great civilizations are cyclic, that civilizations are therefore composite human beings. And as man passes through birth, growth, infancy, maturity, and decline, so cultures have great cyclic patterns, moving inevitably from their humble beginnings with tremendous energy and little experience, to their ends, which is greatness of experience and exhaustion of energy. That things die of fatigue, and that when institutions die, a psychochemistry takes place. Institutions are merely hypothetical boundaries on the continuance of the unbroken stream of human life itself. It may be that a pattern is exhausted, but the persons living in that pattern must in many instances survive it, and must pass through what we call transition periods, periods of moving from one pattern into another. Thus, every 600 years, the human being confronts a personal emergency. The personal emergency is not the collapse of a cycle. The emergency is the danger that he himself will collapse with it, his inability to face transition. We find this even in the shorter cycle of human life, where it is estimated that very few persons are able to maintain individuality of thought, emotion, and action after the 50th year. By that time, the pressure of circumstances, disillusionments, and the gradual depletion of energies results in the individual taking cover in some form, hiding under something, seeking protection, and gradually passing the reins of progress on to someone else. He finds that it is increasingly difficult for him to maintain the momentum of progress. He sees it move by him and becomes a stranger in his own world. Now, every 600 years, according to this ancient calculation, great masses of human beings are confronted with this matter of transition period. These masses of human beings are of all ages individually. The transition may strike one person in childhood and another in maturity and another in advanced years, because the transition represents an arbitrary pattern of climaxes. Now, we like to think of the fact, and often refer to the fact, that we are living perpetually in transition. We are. But we look back over, for instance, the 19th century. The last half of it certainly was, for most persons, a comparatively tranquil period. Not tranquil perhaps in terms of their personal existences, but tranquil in terms of comparatively low taxes, comparative freedom of action, and the ability to live their lives, if in a somewhat humble manner, much according to the dictates of their own consciences, or according to the circumstances which they themselves had created. Now we come into this century and observe the individual more and more the victim of mass motions over which he has no authority. Therefore, we may say that he appears to be approaching a climacteric period. Yet this climacteric period may be only one of the lesser transitional situations that he has to face. Certainly, there is continual transition. But there come times when these transitions heap together, forming such tremendous patterns that they require an almost complete reorientation of a way of life. Later we will observe that the beginning of the Christian era, also one of these 600-year points, was perhaps in the earlier periods of things the greatest and most dynamic of these transition periods. A transition between two ways of life that were never to meet again, that were never to have even valid relationships after they once separated at that time. So here we have what might be termed, in the 6th century BC, the emergence of integrated human record. By some very strange circumstance, also perhaps difficult to classify, but obvious, the year 600 BC is often chosen by historians arbitrarily to represent what they consider the beginning of trustworthy, detailed, chronological descent of events. From 600 BC to the present time, we have an almost unbroken historical record. There are flaws in it, and there are weak points. But never do we get into the same dilemma again that existed in the year 700 BC, when we had almost no records of any kind. There was a broad dividing line. Why? Obviously because the training of men's minds under the impact of the philosophic system began to produce the type of thinking which related events and also prepared for the more conscientious effort to explore history in terms of the mental and moral life of individuals. It was not until about 600 BC that we begin to find historical records of common people, if we want to call them that. Those uncommon individuals whose lives consisted only of ordinary circumstances, untouched by the great motions and glamours of high office. We begin at 600 BC to meet the farmer, the merchant. We begin to see emerging for us the little businessman. We have some contact with the musician, the artist, even the clown. We find the petty politician who never got anywhere coming out as a person. And we also find the interesting emergence of theater and the beginning of a psychological analysis of the foibles of human nature. We find men like Aristippus, and we find playwrights ridiculing the fallacies and foolishness of mortals. We see them picking on characteristics and doing so in those happy days without fear of lawsuit. At that time, human character was in public domain, and you could say anything that you could get away with. Thus, whereas in the 10th or 12th centuries we are told that a certain king or a certain prince overthrew his enemies and built a monument to his own victory, or we hear that the priests of Delphi, one of the more common type of records, in that year reported a certain number of healings